So here we are, concept 40.3. It says homeostatic processes for thermoregulation involve form, function, and behavior. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an example of one of these processes that involve homeostasis. We're going to look at thermal regulation, body temperature regulation, because it's pretty much something that all creatures, living creatures, have to do, especially vertebrate creatures. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about a reptile or a mammal. They have different ways of coping with changing environmental temperatures, but they all have to regulate their internal temperature to some degree. So we're talking about thermoregulation. That's the process by which animals maintain an internal temperature within a tolerable range, and that range can be different for different living creatures. We're going to use this vital function as an example for how form and function work together to regulate an animal's internal environment. The first thing we might want to do is kind of divide creatures into basically two different camps. We have endothermic and ectothermic creatures. Endothermic means that the animals generate, the majority of their heat comes from internal metabolism. So we used to call these creatures warm-blooded. Maybe birds, mammals, those types of creatures you think of, we would call them warm-blooded. They are endothermic. The vast majority of their heat comes from internal metabolism inside their body. Then the other camp would be ectothermic. Ectothermic is animals that gain heat from external sources, or their primary source of heat is external sources. Ectotherms include most invertebrates, as well as fishes, amphibians, and non-avian reptiles like lizards and snakes, turtles, and the like. And we used to perhaps call these cold-blooded. We try to avoid those terms warm-blooded and cold-blooded because they're not very accurate, they're not very scientific. Oftentimes, for example, a lizard sunning himself on a rock on a sunny summer day, his internal body temperature may be quite a bit higher than most mammals on the same day in the same location. So why would you call a lizard cold-blooded if his internal body temperature is higher in that case than most of the mammals around him? So warm-blooded, cold-blooded are kind of archaic terms we don't really use anymore, but endothermic and ectothermic tell you where do they get the majority of their heat. Is it internal metabolism or is it from the external environment? In general, ectotherms, creatures that get the majority of their heat from the outside environment, they can tolerate greater variation in internal temperature. They can go higher and lower. Most endotherms have a pretty narrow range of temperature that they have to keep. So they have the ability to do that, but they also suffer greater if the external temperature rises and falls, and if that causes their internal temperature to rise and fall too much, they will often suffer a greater amount than an ectotherm will. Endothermy is more energetically expensive than ectothermy. Endotherms require a higher metabolism, a greater input of energy, because they are doing the work inside to keep this homeostasis, to keep this balance inside. Ectotherms are what we would call more efficient in their overall energy usage, and they are going to make use of behavioral adaptations to help further regulate their body temperature. So they will lay out on a sunny rock when they are cold, or they will get in the shade or in the water or something when they are warm, and they will have behavioral adaptations that allow them to regulate their temperature as opposed to just relying on internal mechanisms. Good example here in your textbook of a endotherm, a walrus, which of course is a mammal. He regulates his body temperature even though the external temperature may be 0 or under 0 degrees Fahrenheit. He has the ability to maintain a steady internal body temperature. And then a lizard is a non-avian reptile, a good example of an ectotherm, who will use the external environment to kind of maintain and modulate his internal temperature. We can also divide creatures into two camps based on how their body temperature relates to the external environment. A body temperature of a poikilotherm varies with its environment. This is from the Greek word poikilos, which means varied. So the body temperature of a poikilotherm varies with its environment. The body temperature of a homeotherm is relatively constant. And you might think, okay, well, all of the ectotherms or poikilotherms and all of the endotherms are homeotherms. And for the most part, you might be correct, but that rule doesn't always hold true. The relationship between the heat source and the body temperature is not necessarily fixed. That is, not all poikilotherms are ectotherms. For example, a lot of small rodents, like small little mice and small types of little ground squirrels, hummingbirds, other creatures, they undergo periods of reduced activity, which we're going to talk about later, called torpor, and with that reduced activity, their body temperatures can fall well below the norm. So they are endotherms, but sometimes they act as poikilotherms. In other words, their body temperature does vary with the environment. So as a general rule, I would agree, and I would say that ectotherms are poikilotherms and endotherms are homeotherms, but there are some variations and there are some examples where that doesn't always hold true. The environmental factors that creatures have to basically fight against if they want to maintain an internal stable body temperature are the 4 physical processes whereby they lose or exchange heat or thermal energy with the environment. It's going to be radiation, evaporation, convection, and conduction. And you've probably heard most of these before or discussed most of these before. If you're talking about a human being here who out in the cold weather, he is going to radiate heat from his body because he's warmer than the external environment. He has convection, which is the wind currents that set up and remove heat from his body. He also mentions here in this picture respiration, evaporation, which would be like a sweat leaving his skin and taking thermal energy with it, and then conduction, which is touch between, say, his skin, the material that he's wearing, and the cold ground underneath. So if we look at an animal, it also has to work against these 4 factors, or it has heat exchange between the organism and its environment in these 4 different ways. You have radiation, where he could be absorbing a radiation, a thermal energy from the sun, and also giving some off to the external air around him. He has evaporation of, say, saliva, or in some cases with some creatures, sweat. He has conduction, where the physical contact with the rock, and he has convection, which is currents of some form of a liquid or gas that is also removing thermal energy from his body. If we want to be even more specific and talk about the different body parts that are involved, say if we look at a mammal like a dog or a human or a camel, the heat regulation in creatures such as mammals often involves what we call the integumentary system, which we'll talk about later. The integumentary system is basically all the outer coverings. That would include, of course, your skin, your hair, and your nails. And there's basically 5 adaptations that help animals thermoregulate or keep this internal temperature within a certain range. One of those is insulation, circulatory adaptations, cooling by evaporative heat loss, behavioral responses, and then adjusting the metabolic heat production. If we're talking about insulation, of course, if you're thinking of, say, a bird, you might talk about the feathers or the fur in a mammal, or the fat or blubber, the layers of fat underneath the animal's skin. All of these things act like insulation, and they reduce the energy transfer, the thermal energy transfer between the body and the environment. Especially important in a creature that lives, say, in a cold aquatic environment like a walrus or a whale, because water is a much better conductor of thermal energy than the air is, and so you have to have layers of blubber or layers of fat as insulation, because hair and feathers don't do a very good job when they are wet as far as insulating, because they insulate by trapping air pockets, air spaces. So if you live in the water, you have to have layers of blubber or fat underneath your skin to help insulate your body. Otherwise, you're going to lose a tremendous amount of body heat. Circulatory adaptations are also important for creatures to maintain homeostasis as far as their thermal temperature, their body temperature is concerned. They can regulate heat loss through regulating blood flow near the body surface. So when we're talking about endotherms and even some ectotherms, they can alter the amount of blood flowing between the inner core of the body and the outer covering of the skin. So you have, at the bottom here, you have a normal cross-section of a blood vessel. If the animal is cold, it might go through what's called vasoconstriction, where it decreases the blood flow near the skin and helps minimize heat loss. If the animal is too hot, it'll undergo vasodilation, where it will open those blood vessels and increase blood flow near the surface skin to get rid of excess heat. And you've seen this before in yourself or in other humans. When you're hot, sweaty, and exercising outside, your face turns red or your skin turns kind of reddish because of vasodilation. Your blood vessels open up and they transport more blood toward the surface of the body to allow heat from the internal portion of the body to escape. There's also something called countercurrent exchange. It's an arrangement of blood vessels where the arteries and veins are directly overlapping or touching each other. And this happens a lot in certain marine mammals and birds where they are trying to keep their extremities warm. So think about the feet of a penguin or the flippers of a whale in the cold ocean waters. They have what's called countercurrent heat exchange, where the arterial blood coming from the interior of the body, which is nice and warm, and the venous blood coming back from the extremities that's kind of cold, those blood vessels run right up against each other. So some of the heat from the interior of the body can get transferred to that venous blood coming from the exterior portion. So it's kind of like using a radiator in a car or tubing to kind of transfer heat from one body part to another. So because the arteries and veins run right close beside each other, some of the heat from the arteries seeps into the veins and helps transfer and kind of keep that heat more constant throughout the extremities, such as the flippers and the feet and the like. Good example here in a Canadian goose, who his feet doesn't have the insulative properties of the feathers of the body, and in the flippers of a bottlenose dolphin that may be in cold water, cold areas, is not covered with as much blubber and fat as the rest of the body. So they use countercurrent heat transfer to help keep those parts warm, even though they are more exposed and more away from the center portion of the body. Some bony fishes and sharks also use countercurrent heat exchange. And then also what's interesting is a lot of insects, a lot of endothermic insects also have countercurrent heat exchange in the middle portion of their body, in the thorax, and they are actually using it not to get rid of heat, but to maintain heat and keep it in the middle portion of their body, because most of the muscle activity in this little insect, in the little bumblebee here, occurs in his thorax, and it's more helpful if that area is warmer. It allows the muscle activity to be more efficient. So he keeps heat in his thorax and kind of doesn't allow that heat to travel equally throughout his entire body, because most of the muscle activity is going to happen right there in the thorax where his flight muscles are located. If animals want to lose heat, if they want to cool off, a good common way is through evaporation, evaporative heat loss. If the creature is like a human and has sweat glands, the body produces a liquid made up primarily of water and salts, and that evaporates from the skin. Evaporation is a process that changes the liquid to a gas. Along with it, it takes a large amount of thermal energy. So some creatures don't have sweat glands and they have to do something else, like perhaps you've seen a bird or a dog pant. If you look in the hot summer days when it's over 100 degrees, you look up in the trees and sometimes you'll see birds with their mouth wide open and they are panting like a dog. Because they don't have sweat glands, they are trying to use evaporative cooling of their mouth and beak and those areas covered with saliva to try to cool off the rest of the body, especially the head area. Very important to keep the brain and the skull within a certain temperature. So another thing they can do is they can actually get into the water. You'll see pigs and hippos and other creatures will actually go down into the lakes or the streams or the ponds and get wet, cake themselves in mud perhaps, and that allows for more evaporative cooling to help reduce their body temperature. Finally, there's certain behavioral responses, things that they do to try to cool off or to warm up. Endotherms and ectotherms both use behavioral adaptations or responses to control body temperature. Going back to our bees, on a cold winter's day, the bees will huddle within the hive and they will group up in large chunks to basically maintain and conserve their body warmth. And they will actually do like perhaps you've heard penguins do when they huddle together. They will circulate from the outer circle to the inner circle in a constant rotation, trying to keep each other at a constant temperature. And then in the warm weather, in the spring and the summer, bees will use evaporative cooling. Bees will actually go out and bring water back to the hive and kind of wet down the hive and then fan the hive with their wings to try to evaporate that water and create a cooling effect. So those are good behavioral responses. And of course there are terrestrial invertebrates and other creatures that will dig down into the soil or get into the shade or spend their time lounging in the heat of the day and only come out and do their activity at night, things like that. Even some creatures like invertebrates, like insects, like a dragonfly, will adopt certain postures to try to minimize the absorption of solar heat. So this little guy right here, this dragonfly, you notice he's in this very upright position. Well, there's a reason for that. This is called the obelisk posture, and this posture reduces the amount of body surface that is exposed to the sun, and so that reduces the amount of heat he's going to be picking up from his environment, trying to keep his body temperature in check. Finally, creatures can do things internally. They can adjust various metabolic processes inside of their body to kind of regulate their heat. Thermogenesis is the adjustment of metabolic heat production to maintain body temperature. And you've seen this in yourself. On a cold day, if you forget your jacket, you're going to start shivering, your teeth start chattering. That muscle activity is a way to produce heat. So that is a good example of thermogenesis. Your body is producing heat by moving muscles. Those working muscles give off the byproduct of thermal energy. Non-shivering thermogenesis takes place when hormones cause mitochondria to increase their metabolic activity. So even at the cellular level, cells themselves don't really shiver, but they can increase the activity of the mitochondria, and that will increase their thermal energy output, increase the temperature overall. Some ectotherms can also shiver to increase body temperature. So even some creatures that are, you would think of, remember we said you might have called them cold-blooded, such as snakes or reptiles, will even shiver to kind of increase their body temperature. So although they are relying on the outer environment to do most of the work, they still also do some internal things to maintain a certain temperature. Your book shows a couple different experiments where something like a Burmese python, when it's incubating its eggs, will go through a shivering process, contracting its muscles to warm up as it helps to try to keep those eggs warm, just like a chicken would sit on its eggs. And then like with a moth here, it talks about how they go through pre-flight warm-up. They go through muscle contractions, particularly again in their thorax, to warm up their thorax. You can see how that pre-flight warm-up warms up those muscles in the thorax to get them ready for flight. Just like creatures can acclimate themselves to a variety of external conditions we talked about, like the elk acclimating itself to the thinner air of the mountaintops, they can also do this to some degree with temperature. Birds and mammals can vary their insulation to acclimate themselves to seasonal temperature changes. That's why, say, for example, certain creatures will load up on food in the spring and summer and try to gain fat reserves so they can make it through the winter. That's going to be a combination of storing energy as well as insulating their body. And then there are even some creatures who have the ability to live in sub-zero temperatures, where their body temperature almost or sometimes even falls below the temperature of water freezing. So you have certain fish, for example, that can survive in waters as cold as -2 degrees Celsius, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's below the freezing temperature of water. So here we're talking about salt water, so it can actually dip down below the temperature of freezing fresh water. But how does their blood and the liquid inside their body not freeze? Well, they actually produce certain antifreeze compounds, certain chemicals that allow the liquids inside their body to drop below the normal freezing temperature. That would definitely be an advantageous adaptation to their environment. Last but not least, we want to talk about the physiological thermostats of the body. Just like a room may have a thermostat that controls the heat and the air conditioning, the body, particularly like say the human body, does as well. We call that the hypothalamus. It's a portion of the brain which acts like the thermostat for the body. It controls thermoregulation. And just like a thermostat inside a room is triggered by the temperature, the hypothalamus triggers heat loss or heat generating mechanisms based on what the body needs. So if it's cold outside and your body temperature needs to rise, the hypothalamus may cause your muscles to shiver. Or if you are too hot and you are exercising on a summer day, the hypothalamus may say our body temperature is rising, we need to try to keep that in check, and it may send out a signal to cause sweating to occur. So the hypothalamus is basically the thermostat for the body. And finally, one good example of when it might purposely raise the temperature is during a fever. If you've ever had an infection or you've been sick and your temperature goes up to 99, 100, 101 degrees, that's actually the body trying to eradicate whatever it is that's making you sick. Most bacteria or viruses that invade the human body do well at about 98 degrees. That's why they choose the human body to infect. But if you raise that temperature to 101, a lot of those bacteria and viruses don't do so well. So this is the body's way of trying to kill off and eradicate some of what might be making you sick. So it may not make you feel good, but it's trying to do the best that it can to eliminate a particular problem. It's the body's way of disrupting the normal pathway of these creatures that are likely going to be doing best at 98, 99 degrees. So raising the temperature and along with your immune system, helping fight off these infectious creatures such as bacteria or viruses, is a way of making you feel miserable in the short run, but hopefully making you feel better in the long run. We're going to take one last break. Here's a nice little picture that comes out of your textbook there that shows basically how the hypothalamus acts like a thermostat and some of the various things that it does to regulate body temperature. One last break and then we'll come back with our last concept, 40.4. See you in just a moment.